In the last several sessions, we've looked at the different strands of philosophy that have informed and shaped the culture in which we live. You remember our opening session, we considered the analogy of missionaries, that when a missionary goes out to a foreign environment, we don't send a missionary there until they first study the culture to which they're going. And that's what we're trying to do now, is to understand our own culture, the culture in which God has placed us as participants in the mission of the kingdom of God. And we've looked at humanism and existentialism and secularism, and all of these isms, I think, are words that at least most people are vaguely familiar with. But today, we're going to consider positivism. Positivism as a philosophical system, a life and worldview. Now, how many of you have never heard of the concept positivism? How many have never heard of logical positivism? Okay, most of you have never heard of logical positivism, but the majority have heard of positivism? I doubt it. Okay, I doubt it. I'm not thinking of the opposite of negativism, of positivism in the sense of accentuating the positive and eliminating the negative and watching out for Mr. In-Between, you know. I'm talking about a philosophical movement called positivism. How many have never heard of that? Now we're getting more in our hands on. All right, that's what I thought. I was convinced that a majority of people would not have heard of it because it's not a word that is tossed around regularly in our culture. But it is a movement that has its roots in the 19th century in Europe that has had an enormous impact in the shaping of the culture in which we live today. Now, the name that is usually associated with the founding of positivism as a philosophy is the name Auguste Comte. Now, how many have never heard of him? Okay, I didn't think. I mean, he's just not as famous as Freud and Marx and Kierkegaard and some of the others that we've considered here. But Auguste Comte was working in the realm of science and philosophy in the 19th century, and this man had a vision for the complete reformation of human society. He saw himself as a reformer. And what he wanted to do was to implement changes in his modern world that would reflect the enormous steps of progress, as he considered it, that Western civilization had moved through the period of the Enlightenment and into the scientific and industrial revolution of the 19th century. He wanted to see all of society transformed by a new kind of philosophy that would be brought about by what Comte called the dominance of scientific knowledge. He wanted to see a culture and a society established scientifically rather than philosophically or theologically, but to apply the new advances that the scientific revolution had brought about for Western man. Now, I'm going to erase his name now and go back to the principal problem that ties all of these philosophical systems together that we're considering now. If you recall, when we lectured on secularism, that I talked about the difference between the eternal realm and the temporal realm. The fact that the key point of secularism is that man must live his life in the now, that we have no access, no point of entry to the eternal transcendent realm. Now, I draw this double line across the board to indicate the barrier that exists between the eternal up here, or the transcendent realm, the realm where we put God, and down here is the realm of time and space. Now we can look at this a little bit further. We mentioned that the ancient problem of philosophy that thinkers have wrestled with throughout history is how do we make sense out of all the particulars that we encounter in our life. We see dogs, we see trees, we see kangaroos, we see rivers, we see rocks, we see hills, we see people. And you have all of these particular entities that appear before us in this world of space and time. And what we call those things are phenomena. Phenomena. A phenomena is a data bit, a unit of experience that we perceive, that we observe. The word for phenomenon, or the plural phenomena, has to do with things that we can basically see, okay? That appear to our senses. And so in this world down here, you have all these little bits of diversity. Animal, vegetable, mineral, and all the rest. All of the diversity that makes up this world. Now the question of ancient philosophy was what? How does this all fit together? Is there anything that unifies the individual particular bits or the phenomena of the world that we experience? Okay. Now, historically, we sought to harmonize or unify all of these data bits by pointing to some kind of transcendent point of unity or unification. And for the Christian, what is that one being that makes sense and integrates and coalesces all of the different pieces of phenomena?
God is the creator.
God, okay? So that the theological answer to sense and coherence is established by the doctrine or the existence of God. Philosophy tried to establish some point of reference. That is, if you weren't theologically inclined, philosophy could seek it in some kind of abstract principle like reason, or mind, or whatever. And the quest for ultimate truth above this line we called in philosophy the science of what? Do you remember? This is the physical realm, the realm that we can measure, the realm that we can see and taste and touch and hear. Aha! So that realm which goes beyond or above the physical realm we called what? Again? Metaphysical. So that metaphysics was a philosophical attempt to bring sense and coherence out of all of the disparate pieces of this world. All right? Now, this is just so far a review of what we've basically been talking about. And we're going to see this again in our next session when we consider pluralism as an ism in our society. But now, for Comte, what he is saying is that there is a natural law not only that governs planetary motions or gravity or how seeds germinate in the earth, but there's also a natural law of society. And just as in the evolution, in the biological sciences, is a movement from the simple to the complex, a movement from the simplistic to the mature, so there are laws at work in the development of society, and that man is going through stages in his own societal progress. And that man goes through infancy, and then through adolescence, and then he reaches his adult phase of maturity. And that's not only true of individuals, says Comte, but it's also true of cultures and society. And his sweeping, panoramic view of Western history is that mankind has gone through these three stages of development. The first stage, or the infantile stage, is where people seek a theological or religious answer to the meaning of life. So that in the early development of Western civilization, religion dominates the shaping of culture, because man superstitiously attributes the unifying force to his world to the person of God. But then as man begins to grow up and passes through this earlier stage of infancy and moves into adolescence and becomes a little bit more sophisticated, then he moves away from religion and theology and moves into the state of philosophy, into the metaphysical stage, where now he has a more complex, more abstract system of reason or whatever that is above the line. But he only reaches adulthood when he recognizes, with maturity, that the world is to be understood not by religion or by philosophy, but by science. And so we need a new society established on the basis of science rather than religion or philosophy. Now, he shared the skepticism of some other thinkers earlier than he, that this whole realm up here above the line is unknowable. You can't get over this wall or around it, so that man, as in the rest of secularist philosophies, is left to understand himself and his world on this side of the barrier, in the world of the phenomena, the world of the particulars, the world of diversity. There is no una to the universe. Remember the word universe? Combination of unity and what? Diversity. And so that the classical model was that all of the diversity of this world is unified ultimately in God or in some abstract principle. Not for Comte. There is only diversity, no unity. Science busies itself and considers simply the particulars of this world. And he said, incidentally, that there is only one absolute principle. There are no universals. This is the universal realm. No universals save one. There is no absolutes save one. The only absolute, he said, was that everything is relative. Everything is relative. So he is absolutely saying that are absolutely no absolutes, except the absolute that there are absolutely no absolutes. Everything is relative. Okay? Now, this man tried to translate this into a workable religion as such. He tried to establish what he called the religion of humanity. And in London, in Chapelgate, for example, in the middle of the 19th century, the positivists who rallied around Comte built what was called the Positivist Temple. Thomas Huxley, who was involved in some of this, responded to Comte's philosophy by saying what he has given Western civilization is simply Catholicism minus Christianity. That was a sort of a summary dismissal of Comte's new religion by Thomas Huxley. He called it Catholicism minus Christianity. Religion without God. See, it is a religion based upon science and the scientific control of our environment, with man at the center. Well, as I said at the beginning, most of us have not even heard of Auguste Comte. He tends to be obscure to the general population, although he must be studied if somebody's a technical scholar in the field of the history of philosophy. But as I mentioned, his impact went way beyond his own personal version of what positivism should look like. In fact, one of the dominant forces early on in the 20th century in the realm of philosophy is another school of thought that builds upon the 19th century foundation of positivism, only gets a little more sophisticated, and it is called logical positivism, which incidentally is one of the most important and one of the most dominant philosophical movements of the 20th century. How many of you have heard of logical positivism? How many haven't? Okay, that's all right. Let me just back up a second and say that the two, in my opinion, the two most influential 20th century schools of philosophy in our culture have been existentialism, which we've already considered in brief, and analytical philosophy. If your son or daughter wanted to go and study philosophy in a university today, the chances are that if he entered into, picked a school, a graduate school of philosophy at any major university, the chances would be about 80% that the dominant motif in that school of philosophy would be what we call analytical philosophy. So analytical philosophy has been a dominant force. Now, analytical philosophy is not the same thing as logical positivism, but it is the outgrowth of logical positivism. It stands in a direct historical line to logical positivism, which in turn goes back to the positivism of the 19th century. Logical positivism emerged as a philosophical force in this world largely in the 30s and 40s. It had its roots in a group of thinkers who banded together in Vienna in the 1920s. And this group was simply called the Vienna Circle. The Vienna Circle. It's an incredible thing in the history of philosophy how little schools of thought, very closely knit groups, can have an unbelievable impact. Last time when we looked at pragmatism, I talked about the Metaphysical Club at Harvard that included Pierce and James and Oliver Wendell Holmes, just a couple of guys, and they changed the shape of modern society. You go back to Athens and think of the relationship between four men that were very closely interconnected. Socrates, whose disciple was Plato, whose disciple was Aristotle, whose chief disciple and most famous was Alexander the Great. Those four men. In any case, it's interesting to see in the history of philosophy how little groups like this can expand and just have enormous impact on civilization. Well, the Vienna Circle was a group of mathematicians and scientists who held as a goal the elimination of metaphysics and theology from any influence on culture. They were after both theology and philosophy. They wanted to free science altogether from any dependency on philosophical systems and let science reign supreme. They were convinced that the issue of the existence of God, looked at from a scientific perspective, was a waste of time. In other words, you had debates between theists and atheists, people who thought they could prove the existence of God and people who thought they could disprove the existence of God. There's a sense in which the positivists, the logical positivists of Vienna, tried to cut the Gordian knot and simply say, all conversation about God, whether he exists or doesn't exist, is meaningless. Because the very word God is a meaningless word. Now, what if somebody came to you and said, the word God is meaningless? It's absolutely meaningless. Is that true for you? Does the word God mean anything to you? Huh? Does it mean a lot to you? There have been people who have died for the sake of the name of God, the sanctity of the name of God. And here comes, these men come along and say, the word God itself is meaningless. Well, when you say it's meaningful and they say it's meaningless, it might be because you're working on different criteria on what constitutes meaning and how we determine meaningfulness. And this is what the logical positivists were trying to do. We're trying to come and tell us and to establish the rules of meaning. How we decide whether something is meaningful or not. And they sought to bring about scientific methods to do this. Now, so what the great contribution or innovation of logical positivism was the establishment of what was called the verification principle. The verification principle. The verification principle, simply stated, is this: that no assertion, no statement is meaningful unless it is either analytical or synthetic. Now, that's simple, isn't it? Or to state it another way, no statement is meaningful unless it can be verified empirically. Now, I'm going to explain what that means, so don't be frightened, okay? What does it mean to verify something?
To prove it true.
To show that it is true. Something claims to be true, and that truth can be examined, or that claim can be examined, and we can either falsify it or verify it, or not or be paralyzed saying we don't know. But we try to either falsify it or verify it. Now, how do we say or verify the truth of the statement that a triangle has 3 angles, or the truth of a statement a husband is a married man? How do you verify the statement that a triangle has 3 sides? What?
By sight.
By sight? Do you need to see a triangle to know that it has 3 sides? Do you need to view a husband to know that he's married?
The word itself means, yeah.
The word, by definition, means what we've just said. A husband, by definition, is a married man. A triangle, by definition, has how many angles?
3 angles.
3 angles. I don't have to see one. I never have to put one in a laboratory. That's what we call an analytical statement. A statement that is true by definition. In order to add knowledge, we need to synthesize. We need to make, we need to find out that triangle is not only has 3 angles, but that it's either gold or silver, that it's big or small. See? The idea of bigness or smallness is not found in the word triangle, is it? Triangle can be big or it can be small. And if I say to you, there's a big triangle out there in the field, if I'm going to prove that or verify it, what am I going to have to do? I'm going to have to go out there and take a look and see whether or not there is a big triangle out there. So that science, according to these men, verifies principally by, I said, the empirical method, by sight, sound, hearing, touching, by seeing. The empirical means of to do with the senses. Now, the bottom line is that statements that cannot be verified empirically are meaningless. All statements that cannot be verified empirically are meaningless. Now, has anybody in this room ever seen God? Has anybody in this room ever tasted God with the taste buds of your tongue? Has anybody been able to subject God to observation or measurement or experimentation in a scientific laboratory? No. So the point is that the word God itself cannot be verified. And since it cannot be verified, it's meaningless. So that religious statements are, at the bottom line, unverifiable and meaningless. Now, that created a crisis for whether or not all of our discussions about God have any meaning whatsoever. What was the Achilles heel of the principle of verification? The principle of verification has been pretty much discarded by analytical philosophers. Why? What's wrong with the principle of verification? Let me tell you the principle of verification. The only meaningful truth is a truth which can be verified either analytically or empirically. It's very easy. It's so obvious it'd bite you if it were a snake. But it was a principle that the original founders missed completely at the beginning. Their whole philosophy rests on what principle?
You've got to see it, or
The truth of the verificational principle. Can the verificational principle be verified empirically? Is the verificational principle analytically true? If a guy stands up and said, the only thing that is true is that which can be verified empirically, can he now verify his statement that the only thing that is true is that which can be verified empirically? No, you can't verify that empirically. It's an utterly gratuitous rule. Remember, they're trying to rewrite the rules of meaning. And if you apply their own rules of meaning to the new rules of meaning that they have foisted upon the public, that rule of meaning collapses. And later philosophers saw that. But, dear friends, don't make any mistake that the impact of that kind of thinking has been enormous to our culture. So that we've seen a whole generation of theologians going through the terrible crisis of whether or not any statements about God are meaningful, or whether or not they're just simply emotive, that is, saying something about you and your emotional makeup rather than that which is scientific. What positivism does is that it divorces science from the whole realm of truth. And trying to make it an independent thing, it cuts science itself from its very foundation and its very roots. Okay? You want to have a universe without union. See? Where you're left in a sea of diversity with no possible foundation for meaning. It cuts you off from meaning. That's an awfully heavy price to pay to grow up. All right, I'll stop there, and in our next session we'll consider further ramifications of this in pluralism.